Nicole Wallace, I think a boisterous discussion got through tonight despite some signal interruptions and some audio problems, which we obviously apologize for.
Yeah, listen, off to the races, right? And I think that this field showed themselves when they broke into Spanish, when they debated the intricacies of policy, when they kept it on what they were for and didn't end up down the rabbit hole of what they were against, when Jay Inslee had that sharp answer of what the greatest threat to the country and the world was and came out with Donald Trump. I mean, together as a field, they've strung together an incredible story about what is possible if Donald Trump isn't reelected to a second term. And really, it's up to Democrats in terms of who spoke to what they're hungering for the most. I'm not sure. People like Claire probably know the answer to that better than me.
Yeah, Senator, as someone who's been in the arena of the U.S. Senate, I noticed the copious notes you were taking.
Yeah, I think overall, I was surprised how little there was a discussion of the mess in the White House right now. I was shocked that more candidates didn't tie their policies into the ineptitude, the chaos, the horrible things this president has done. And it really was a little surprising to me because I think most Democrats, while they want to hear policy and they want to get to know these candidates, they also want to be reassured that we are united, that those candidates are united in terms of Donald Trump. So that surprised me a little. I thought the folks on the end did their best to elbow into every discussion they could. I found it mildly irritating at times.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just de Blasio is mildly irritating to me. I'm not sure, but or maybe even more than mildly irritating to me.
You know what?
You seem pretty irritated.
I had the same reaction. I think that might break down along gender. He sounded to me like sort of an obnoxious guy at a restaurant or a bar talking really loudly on his cell phone, like everyone wants to hear what he's saying. I wanted to hear other people's answers, and he kept butting in.
Clearly his tactic, just to, he was the first to butt in and this and that. I mean, the absence of Trump in this discussion actually surprised me a lot. I thought
almost he who will not be mentioned.
Exactly. It was like Lord Voldemort. You couldn't say his name. Whereas for a lot of people in the country, that is the main issue. I thought maybe looking at the individual candidates, Cory Booker has a presence and a voice and I thought he did himself some good potentially. Beto O'Rourke, I thought, did not have a good evening. His answers to me were mushy, and it was hard to grasp anything in them. Julian Castro was very strong on the details of immigration policy and prodded the others to be more specific. But I think Elizabeth Warren will be happy at the end of this debate. She got a lot of attention, especially during the first hour. I thought, look, she's the clear leader among this 10, and I didn't really think a glove was laid on her by the others.
Elizabeth Warren actually had some long stretches of silence during the immigration debate, and it wasn't her choice. It's just that it went on without her, and moderators were handing it to other people. And also during the climate change debate, two of the most important things. She had, I don't think she had almost any opportunity in there. One of the things that drives the observation that they didn't talk about Donald Trump very much is that most, if not all, of those candidates would be running for president tonight if someone else was the Republican president, if we had a Republican President Bush. And so these are actually positive candidacies that would be running no matter who was in the White House, no matter what Republican was in the White House. But it does seem like there was some kind of conscious decision made to basically try to advance their candidacies as much as they could without the use of the word Trump. And here's why that might be a kind of good experience for Democratic primary voters. They actually got a couple of hours of concentrating on what government and the White House and the presidency would sound like after Trump. And after Trump, they will not be talking about Donald Trump.
Hey
there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.